Alexithymia. Someone asks how you're feeling and you freeze. Not because you don't want to answer, because you genuinely don't know. There's something there, a tightness in your chest, a heaviness. But no word comes close to capturing it. So you say fine, and move on, leaving the question unanswered. This isn't about being private. It's not emotional reserve. It's a condition where the ability to identify and describe emotions is fundamentally broken. The feelings exist. They create physical sensations, tension in the body, changes in heart rate, but the bridge between sensation and language is missing. It's like trying to describe a color you've never learned the name for. For most people, emotions announce themselves clearly. Anger, sadness, joy. They arrive with labels taked. But when this ability is impaired, emotions land as vague discomfort. The mind registers that something is happening, but can't sort it into categories. A breakup might produce the same flat unease as a stressful work deadline. Both feel heavy. Both feel wrong. Neither carries a distinct emotional signature. This creates a gap in relationships. When a partner asks what's wrong, the answer isn't evasion. It's genuine confusion. When someone says you seem upset, the response isn't denial. It's uncertainty. The emotion might be there, but accessing it feels like reaching for something in the dark. Over time, this shapes how connection works. Conversations about feelings become minefields of guesswork. Intimacy requires emotional transparency. But transparency requires knowing what you're feeling first. Without that, relationships stay surface level. Not by choice, by limitation. The other person wants to understand. You want to be understood. But the language for it simply isn't there. The condition doesn't erase emotion. It erases clarity. The feelings still move through you, still shape your reactions, still affect your choices. You just can't name them. And when you can't name something, you can't process it, can't communicate it, can't fully make sense of it. You're left navigating the world with a map where all the emotional landmarks are blank. Emotional blunting. You used to cry at movies. Now, nothing. A character dies. The music swells. You sit there waiting for the sadness to arrive. It doesn't. Not numbness, exactly. Just a muted version of what used to hit hard. Like someone turned the volume down and forgot to turn it back up. This is what happens when emotional intensity flattens. It's not depression's heaviness. Not anxiety's sharp edges. It's the absence of peaks and valleys altogether. Good news lands with a dull thud. Bad news registers as vaguely unfortunate. Everything exists in the same narrow bandwidth. Nothing breaks through. It shows up most clearly in moments that should matter. A promotion at work that should feel exciting produces a faint, "That's nice," and nothing more. A friend's betrayal that should sting just sits there. Acknowledged but not felt. You know intellectually that these things are significant. But the emotional response doesn't match. It's like watching your own life from behind glass. The physical sensations fade too. Laughter feels mechanical. Affection feels performative. Even anger, which used to flare hot and fast, now barely registers as mild irritation. Your face moves through the right expressions. Your voice hits the right tones. But underneath, there's a flatness that wasn't there before. This creates a strange kind of isolation. People around you are reacting, feeling, connecting through shared emotion. You're going through the motions, aware that something is missing but unable to summon it back. Relationships require emotional reciprocity. The back and forth of feeling and response. But when your side of that exchange is blunted, the connection weakens. Not from lack of care, from lack of capacity. This kind of flattening often comes from medication, particularly antidepressants, or from prolonged stress that exhausts the nervous system's ability to respond. The brain, overloaded or chemically altered, stops firing emotional signals at full strength. It's a protective mechanism in some cases. a side effect in others. Either way, the result is the same. Life continues. But the richness drains out of it, leaving only the outline of what feeling used to be. Callousness. Some people don't seem to feel guilt. You hurt them, they hurt you back, and there's no remorse. No second thought. Just a blank where the discomfort should be. It's not that they don't understand what they did. They do. They just don't care. This is callousness, a fundamental lack of concern for the pain you cause others. It's different from alexithymia, where emotions are unreadable, or blunting, where they're muted. Here, the emotional circuitry for guilt and empathy is either shut down or was never fully wired in the first place. The ability to register someone else's suffering exists, but it doesn't trigger the response it should. No discomfort. No urge to repair. Just indifference. Watch how it plays out. A friend cancels plans last minute, leaving you stranded. Most people would feel bad. Apologize. Try to make it right. Someone with high callousness. They shrug it off. You should have had a backup plan. The responsibility slides away. The harm done doesn't register as their problem. It's not cruelty for the sake of it. It's the absence of the internal signal that says, this matters. In relationships, this creates a strange dynamic. The other person keeps expecting accountability that never arrives. Apologies come, sometimes, but they're hollow. Performative. Said because that's what you're supposed to say, not because the guilt is real. Over time, the lack of remorse wears the relationship down. Trust requires knowing the other person will feel bad when they hurt you. When that mechanism doesn't exist, trust has nothing to anchor to. Callousness isn't always a disorder. It exists on a spectrum. Some people are born with lower empathic response. Others develop it as a defense. If caring about others' pain becomes too costly, the brain learns to shut it off. Soldiers, surgeons, people in high-stress roles where emotional detachment is survival, they cultivate a version of this. The difference is control. Healthy detachment can be turned back on. Pathological callousness can't. What makes it unsettling is how invisible it is from the outside. Someone can be charming, articulate, socially adept, and still operate with a core of emotional indifference. The performance is intact. The internal response is missing. And by the time you realize you're dealing with someone who genuinely doesn't feel bad for hurting you, you've already invested too much to walk away easily. Detachment. You're there, but not really there. Sitting across from someone you're supposed to care about, hearing words, nodding at the right moments, but feeling nothing. No warmth. No pull. Just distance, like you're watching the interaction from somewhere else entirely. This kind of emotional detachment operates as self-protection. At some point, being emotionally present became too dangerous. Maybe it led to rejection. Maybe it opened you up to manipulation. Maybe the vulnerability just hurt too much. So the mind starts pulling back. Not consciously. Not all at once. But gradually the walls go up, and staying behind them starts to feel safer than stepping out. The mechanics are simple. Emotional investment carries risk. If you care deeply, you can be hurt deeply. Detachment lowers the stakes. You show up to relationships, go through the expected motions, but keep your actual feelings locked away where they can't be accessed or weaponized. It's not that you don't have emotions. You do. You've just learned not to let them surface where others can reach them. At first, it works. The pain lessens. Disappointments don't sting as hard. Betrayals feel manageable. You're in control, insulated, protected. But the cost becomes clear over time. Intimacy requires presence. Real connection happens when both people are emotionally available, willing to be seen, willing to let the other person matter. Detachment makes that impossible. You can be physically present, verbally engaged, even affectionate in action, but the core of you stays sealed off. People notice. They describe feeling like they're talking to a wall. like you're performing closeness without actually offering it. And they're right. Detachment creates a gap that no amount of surface-level interaction can bridge. The other person reeks for you, and you're just out of range. Not because you're trying to hurt them, because staying distant has become the only way you know how to stay safe. The trap is that detachment, used long enough, stops being a choice. It becomes automatic. Even when you're with someone trustworthy, someone who wouldn't hurt you, the defenses stay up. The emotional distance that once protected you now isolates you. And the harder you try to break through it, the more firmly it locks in place, leaving you present in body but absent in every way that actually matters. Dehumanization. You catch yourself thinking of someone as an obstacle, not a person. The driver who cut you off. The stranger walking too slowly in front of you. The person whose opinion you dismiss without a second thought. It happens fast. So fast you barely notice the shift. But in that moment, they stop being human and become a thing. An inconvenience. A category. This is dehumanization. The psychological process of stripping away someone's individuality and reducing them to something less than human. It doesn't require hatred. It doesn't require intent. It just requires distance. Mental, emotional, or social. The further removed someone is from your immediate circle, the easier it becomes to stop seeing them as fully real. It starts with language. Labels that reduce people to their function or their group. Illegals. Addicts. Karens. The moment you stop using someone's name and start using a category, you've begun the process. Categories don't have feelings. They don't have stories. They're abstractions. And abstractions are easy to dismiss, easy to ignore, easy to harm without the weight of guilt that comes with recognizing someone's humanity. The brain does this as a shortcut. Processing every stranger as a complete person with inner lives, emotions, and complexity is cognitively expensive. So the mind creates shortcuts. It sorts people into groups, assigns traits based on limited information. And once someone is in a box, their individuality gets overridden by the stereotype. You stop seeing them. You see the label. And the label becomes easier to devalue, easier to exclude, easier to justify treating poorly. This doesn't just happen in extreme situations. War, genocide, systemic oppression, yes. Those are built on dehumanization. But it also shows up in everyday interactions. The way you talk about people in traffic. The way you scroll past suffering that doesn't touch you directly. The way certain groups get blamed, mocked, or dismissed without anyone pausing to consider the actual people behind the label. The mechanism is the same. The scale just varies. What makes it dangerous is how automatic it becomes. You don't decide to dehumanize someone. It happens in the background, in the assumptions you make, in the empathy you don't extend. And once it's normalized, once you've practiced seeing certain people as less than, it becomes harder to reverse. The shortcuts solidify. The distance remains. And the line between who deserves your empathy and who doesn't gets drawn without you ever consciously choosing where it falls. Compassion fade. One life lost feels like a tragedy. 1,000 feels like a statistic. You see it in how people react to the news. A child trapped in a well, the whole country holds its breath. 1,000 children dying in a conflict zone, and the response is muted. Acknowledged maybe, but not felt. Not in the same way. The suffering is real. The numbers are real, but the emotional response doesn't scale. It shrinks. This is compassion fade. The larger the number of victims, the less individuals feel compelled to act or care. It's not apathy. It's a limitation in how the brain processes mass suffering. Human empathy evolved to respond to individuals. Faces. Names. Stories. One person in distress triggers the full weight of concern. But when the victims multiply, the emotional system can't keep up. The mind struggles to grasp the scope, so it defaults to abstraction. and abstraction doesn't move us the way a single story does. Researchers have tested this. Show people a photograph of one starving child and donations pour in. Show them statistics about thousands facing the same crisis and contributions drop. The paradox is brutal. The greater the need, the weaker the response. Our capacity for compassion doesn't expand to match the scale of the problem. It contracts. The suffering becomes too large to process, so it gets reduced to numbers. And numbers, no matter how staggering, don't trigger the visceral reaction that a single human face does. This shapes how crises get covered and how aid gets distributed. Media knows this. That's why they focus on individual stories. The refugee family with names and faces. The cancer patient with a GoFundMe. The lost hiker everyone's searching for. Those stories work because they're graspable. The mind can hold one person's pain. It can't hold a million. So the million get filtered out. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But inevitably because the emotional bandwidth isn't there. The danger is in what gets ignored as a result. Large-scale tragedies. Systemic injustices. Slow-moving disasters that affect countless people but don't produce a singular, relatable victim to rally around. They don't generate the same urgency. The compassion fades before it even starts, not because people don't care, but because the scale itself becomes an anesthetic. The brain protects itself from the overwhelm by shutting down the response. And the people who needed that compassion the most end up as background noise. This isn't something you can fully override. You can be aware of it, try to compensate for it. Push yourself to engage with the numbers as though they represent real lives. But the instinct remains. One face will always move you more than 1,000 names on a list. And that gap between what we can feel and what we should feel is where compassion fade does its quietest, most persistent damage. Desensitization. The first time you see something violent on screen, it hits you. Your stomach turns. You look away. But the 10th time, the 100th time, it barely registers. The same image that once disturbed you now passes without reaction. You've adapted. Not because the content changed, because your response to it did. This is desensitization. Repeated exposure to a stimulus dulls the emotional reaction it once triggered. It's not numbness in the clinical sense. It's the brain's efficiency mechanism. When something shows up often enough, the mind stops treating it as significant. The alarm system recalibrates. What once demanded attention now gets filtered as background noise. It happens with violence, with suffering, with cruelty. The more you see it, the less it moves you. News footage of conflict zones, graphic images on social media, even real-world aggression witnessed repeatedly. The first exposure activates a full emotional response. Fear, disgust, concern. But the brain can't sustain that level of activation indefinitely. So it adjusts. The response weakens. The threshold for what counts as shocking rises. And eventually, what used to provoke a visceral reaction barely registers at all. This creates a gap between what you intellectually know is terrible and what you emotionally feel about it. You understand that the thing you're seeing is harmful. But the feeling attached to that understanding has faded. You can describe why it's wrong. You just can't summon the emotional weight that used to accompany that judgment. The knowledge remains. The gut reaction disappears. The danger isn't just in what you stop reacting to. It's in how that recalibration affects your behavior. Desensitization doesn't just make you less disturbed. It makes you more willing to tolerate, dismiss, or participate in the very things that used to bother you. The line between observer and participant gets easier to cross when the emotional cost of crossing it has been worn down through repetition. What started as a protective adaptation, your mind shielding you from constant emotional overload, becomes a liability. The more desensitized you become, the harder it is to recognize when something genuinely deserves your concern. The alarm system that once kept you alert to harm stops functioning reliably. and by the time you notice the shift, you've already accepted as normal what you once would have found unacceptable. Emotional numbing. After something unbearable happens, the mind does something unexpected. It shuts the emotions down, not selectively, not just the painful ones, all of them. Joy, sadness, fear, excitement. They all get muted, flattened, pushed so far down they stop being accessible. It's not a choice. It's the brain protecting itself the only way it knows how. This kind of numbing shows up after trauma, after prolonged stress, after events that exceed the mind's capacity to process them in real time. The emotional system, overwhelmed, stops responding. Not because the feelings are gone, because letting them surface feels too dangerous, so they get locked away. And what's left is a strange, hollow calm. You function. You go through the day, but the emotional range that used to define your experience narrows to almost nothing. People describe it as living behind a pane of glass. You see things happening. You recognize that they should matter, but the connection between recognition and feeling is severed. A loved one's smile should warm you. It doesn't. Bad news should upset you. It barely registers. The emotions exist somewhere, buried, but the access point is gone. And without access, you're left going through life in a state of detached observation, watching yourself exist without fully inhabiting the experience. The numbness isn't uniform. Sometimes brief flashes of emotion break through. Anger usually. Or a sudden wave of grief that disappears as quickly as it arrived. But those moments are exceptions. The baseline is flatness, and the longer it persists, the more it starts to feel permanent. You forget what it was like to feel things fully. The numbness becomes the new normal, and the thought of letting the emotions back in, of removing the protective barrier, feels more terrifying than staying numb. Relationships suffer first. Emotional reciprocity requires presence. It requires the ability to feel alongside someone else, to mirror their joy, to share their pain. But when you're numb, that reciprocity breaks down. You're there in body, but emotionally absent. The other person reeks for connection and finds nothing to hold on to. They interpret it as coldness, as indifference. They don't realize you're not withholding emotion intentionally. You're locked out of your own emotional system, unable to access what you'd give them if you could. Recovery is slow, if it happens at all. The brain that shut down to protect you doesn't automatically reopen once the threat has passed. The numbing, initially adaptive, becomes self-sustaining. And the longer you stay in that state, the harder it becomes to remember what feeling used to be like, or to believe that returning to it is even possible. Empathy deficit. Someone's telling you about their worst day. Their voice cracks. Their eyes water. You know you're supposed to feel something, but you don't. You nod. You say the right words. But the emotional resonance they're looking for, the sense that you're with them in their pain, it's just not there. You're observing their distress from a distance. Noting it, not feeling it. This is what it looks like when empathy is impaired. The capacity to emotionally attune to someone else's experience, to feel what they're feeling or at least approximate it, is diminished or absent. It's not about understanding. You can intellectually grasp that the person is upset. You can predict how they'll react. You can even mimic the appropriate response. But the emotional mirroring, the automatic resonance that connects one person's feelings to another's, doesn't activate. For some, this is developmental. The neural circuitry that supports empathy didn't wire correctly. For others, it's acquired. Prolonged exposure to others' suffering, chronic stress, or deliberate emotional suppression can erode empathic capacity over time. Either way, the result is the same. Other people's emotions register as information, not as experiences to be shared. You process their distress cognitively, but it doesn't land emotionally. It doesn't move you. In practice, this creates a breakdown in connection. Empathy is the glue that holds relationships together. It's what makes someone else's pain feel urgent to you. What drives you to comfort, to help, to adjust your behavior to avoid causing harm? When that mechanism is missing, relationships become transactional. You respond to others based on social expectation, not emotional pull. You perform care without feeling it. And over time, people notice. They describe you as distant, detached, unable to truly connect. The absence of empathy doesn't always mean cruelty. Some people with empathy deficits are deeply moral. They've constructed ethical frameworks that guide their behavior in the absence of emotional resonance. They do the right thing because they've reasoned it out, not because they feel compelled to. But it's effortful. It requires constant cognitive oversight. And in moments of stress, when cognitive resources are depleted, the gap becomes obvious. The care that should flow naturally has to be manually constructed. And the other person, waiting for warmth, gets logic instead. What makes this particularly isolating is that the deficit is often invisible. You can speak the language of emotion. You've learned the scripts. You know when to express concern, when to offer sympathy, when to show excitement for someone else's success. But it's performance. And performance, no matter how skilled, can't fully replicate the experience of genuine emotional connection. The other person feels the difference, even if they can't name it. And you're left going through the motions, but knowing something essential is missing, but unable to access what it would take to fill the gap. Coldness in affect. People say you're hard to read, that you seem distant. Not unfriendly, exactly. Just absent in a way they can't quite place. Your face doesn't move much when you speak. Your voice stays even. You don't light up. You don't darken. You stay in the same narrow emotional register, no matter what's happening around you. This is coldness in affect. Not the temperature of your actual feelings, but the way those feelings, or lack of them, present to the outside world. Flat expression. Minimal vocal variation. A stillness that reads, to others, as emotional unavailability. You might be feeling something underneath, or you might not. But either way, it doesn't show. And in a world where emotional communication happens as much through expression as through words, that absence registers as a wall. For some, it's intentional. A cultivated distance, a way of maintaining control by refusing to let emotions surface visibly. For others, it's not a choice. The expressive capacity is genuinely limited. The face doesn't naturally reflect the internal state. The voice doesn't modulate in response to emotion. It's not suppression. It's the absence of the automatic mechanisms that translate feeling into visible signal. What this does to relationships is subtle but corrosive. Humans rely on emotional cues to navigate interaction. A smile signals warmth. A furrowed brow signals concern. A shift in tone signals engagement. When those cues are missing, the other person is left guessing. They can't gauge your interest. They can't tell if you're pleased or disappointed, engaged or bored. The feedback loop that makes conversation feel reciprocal breaks down. And over time, they stop trying to reach you. Not because they don't care. Because the effort of connecting with someone who gives nothing back emotionally is exhausting. The coldness isn't always passive. Sometimes it's weaponized. In conflict, refusing to show emotion can be a form of control. The other person escalates, trying to provoke a reaction, trying to get you to show that you care. You remain impassive, and the more desperate they become for a sign of emotional engagement, the more power the stillness holds. It's a refusal to participate. And in that refusal, the dynamic tilts entirely in your favor. But even when it's not intentional, the effect is isolating. People interpret coldness as rejection, as lack of investment, as proof that you don't care as much as they do. They pull back. They stop sharing. They build their own walls in response to yours. And what started as a mismatch in expressive capacity becomes a relational pattern where distance begets more distance. until the connection, if it survives at all, exists only at the surface, functional, polite, empty. Callous-Unemotional Traits. Some children don't cry when they're punished, don't flinch when others are hurt, don't seem to feel bad when they've done something wrong. It's not defiance, it's not anger. It's the absence of the emotional responses that typically keep behavior in check. Guilt, empathy, fear of consequences. They're either muted or missing entirely. And what you're left with is a child who operates without the internal brakes most people take for granted. These are callous-unemotional traits. A cluster of characteristics that show up early, sometimes as young as toddlerhood, and persist across development. Low empathy, shallow emotions, lack of remorse, an inability or unwillingness to recognize others' distress as something that should matter. It's not sociopathy, not yet. But it's the developmental precursor. The temperament that, left unaddressed, can harden into something far more concerning. What makes these traits particularly unsettling is their stability. Most children go through phases of selfishness, of testing boundaries, of hurting others without fully grasping the impact. But they grow out of it. The empathy circuitry comes online. The capacity for guilt develops. Behavior shifts in response to emotional learning. But for children with these traits, that shift doesn't happen. The emotional foundation that would normally guide moral development never fully forms. And without it, the behavior that should naturally decrease as the child matures continues unchecked. In practice, this looks like a child who manipulates without hesitation, who lies smoothly, who uses charm strategically to get what they want, then discards people once they're no longer useful. Punishment doesn't deter them. Not because they're brave. Because the emotional cost of punishment, the shame or guilt that would normally create a deterrent effect, doesn't register. They calculate risk versus reward. And if the reward is high enough, the risk becomes irrelevant. The trouble is in intervention. Most behavioral strategies rely on emotional leverage. You teach a child not to hurt others by activating their capacity for guilt, for empathy, for concern about how their actions affect people they care about. But when those emotional levers don't exist, the standard approach fails. You can enforce consequences. You can structure their environment to limit harm. But you can't instill the internal motivation to care. That requires an emotional substrate that, in some cases, simply isn't there to build on. This doesn't mean hopelessness. Early intervention can help. Teaching prosocial behavior through reward rather than guilt. Structuring empathy as a cognitive skill rather than emotional one. Building habits that mimic care even if the underlying feeling is absent. But it's a narrow path. And the longer the traits go unaddressed, the more entrenched they become. By adolescence, the pattern is set. And what started as a concerning temperament in a young child becomes a fixed personality structure that defines how they move through the world and how much damage they leave in their wake. Moral disengagement. You know it's wrong, but you do it anyway, and somehow in the moment it doesn't feel wrong. You've convinced yourself there's a reason. A justification. A way of framing the action that makes it acceptable, even necessary. The harm you're causing doesn't register as harm, because you've mentally restructured the situation until the moral weight of it disappears. This is moral disengagement. The set of cognitive tricks people use to bypass their own ethical standards without experiencing guilt. It's not ignorance. You're aware of the moral rule you're violating. You've just found a way to tell yourself it doesn't apply here. That this situation is different. That the person on the receiving end doesn't count. That the outcome justifies the means. Whatever the specific rationalization, the function is the same. It lets you act against your stated values while maintaining the belief that you're still a good person. The mechanisms are predictable. You reframe the behavior. Lying becomes protecting someone's feelings. Cheating becomes leveling the playing field. Harm becomes tough love. The action stays the same. The label changes. And the new label carries less moral weight, so the discomfort fades. You've linguistically sanitized what you're doing, and the sanitized version feels easier to live with. Or you shift responsibility. I was just following orders. Everyone else was doing it. I didn't have a choice. By distributing accountability across the group or up the chain of command, you dilute your personal role. You become a cog in a system rather than an agent making a choice. And once you've externalized the responsibility, the guilt has nowhere to land. It's not your fault. You were just doing what the situation demanded. Or you dehumanize the target. This works especially well when the person you're harming is distant, abstract, or part of a group you've already othered. They stop being a person with feelings and become a category, a problem, an obstacle. And once they're no longer fully human in your mind, harming them stops feeling like a moral violation. You're not hurting someone. You're solving a problem. The emotional friction that would normally stop you evaporates. The danger is how automatic this becomes. You don't sit down and consciously decide to disengage your morals. It happens in the background. A quick mental adjustment. A reframing that happens so fast you don't even notice it occurring. And once the disengagement is in place, the behavior follows effortlessly. You act in ways you'd condemn in others, and the cognitive dissonance that should stop you never even surfaces. Because you've already preemptively resolved it by telling yourself a story where you're still the good guy. And as long as that story holds, the harm you cause stays invisible. Not to the people on the receiving end, but to you. And that invisibility is what lets it continue. Interpersonal distance preference. You keep people at arm's length, not out of hostility, not because you dislike them, but because closeness feels suffocating. The moment someone tries to get too near, emotionally or physically, something in you recoils. You pull back. You create space. And you protect that space like it's the only thing keeping you safe. This isn't shyness. It's not introversion. It's a deliberate structuring of relationships to maintain distance. You engage, but only to a point. You share, but only surface details. The deeper layers, the parts that would make you vulnerable, stay locked away. And anyone who tries to access them gets met with a wall. Polite. Friendly even, but impenetrable. For some, this preference develops as protection. Maybe intimacy led to betrayal. Maybe closeness meant losing autonomy. Maybe letting people in resulted in pain too sharp to risk again. So the brain learns. It adjusts. It establishes a perimeter. And once that perimeter is in place, enforcing it becomes automatic. You don't consciously decide to keep people out. You just do. The distance maintains itself. The mechanics are subtle. You answer questions without really answering them. You deflect personal topics. You steer conversations back to the other person or to neutral ground. You're present, engaged, responsive. But you're managing the interaction to ensure it never goes deeper than you're willing to allow. And most people don't notice. They think they know you. They don't realize they're only seeing the version you've made available. Over time, this creates a strange kind of loneliness. You're surrounded by people. You have relationships. But none of them touch the core of who you are. The part of you that craves connection, that wants to be fully known, stays isolated. Because being known requires letting someone close. And letting someone close feels too dangerous. So you stay in the space between isolation and intimacy. Connected enough to function, distant enough to stay safe. The cost becomes visible in moments of crisis. When life demands support, when you need someone to lean on, there's no one close enough to reach. The relationships you've cultivated, carefully kept at a distance, can't bear that kind of weight. They were never designed to. And the realization hits. You've protected yourself so thoroughly that you've also locked yourself out of the kind of connection that could actually help. The distance that felt like safety becomes a cage. And by the time you recognize it, the pattern is too entrenched to easily reverse. Protective shutdown. The argument escalates. Voices rise. Emotions spike. And you go blank. Not angry. Not defensive. Just gone. Your face goes still. Your voice flattens. You stop responding, stop reacting, stop participating. It's not a choice. It's the brain pulling the emergency brake, shutting everything down before the situation overwhelms you completely. This kind of shutdown is a survival response. When emotional intensity exceeds what you can process, the system cuts off. Not to punish the other person. Not to manipulate. Simply to protect. The nervous system, flooded with stress signals it can't handle, disengages. You're still physically present. But emotionally, you've checked out. The lights are on, but no one's home. It happens fast. One moment you're engaged, trying to navigate the conflict. The next, you've gone numb. The emotions that were there seconds ago disappear. The thoughts slow down. The urgency fades. You're in observation mode now, watching the interaction from a distance, detached from the outcome. It's not calm. It's not peace. It's the absence of access to your own emotional system. For the other person, it's bewildering. They're still activated, still trying to resolve whatever triggered the conflict. But you've left the conversation. They escalate further, trying to get a reaction, trying to pull you back in. It doesn't work. The more they push, the deeper the shutdown goes. And what started as a protective mechanism becomes a weapon. Your absence, your emotional unavailability in the moment they need engagement, inflicts its own kind of harm. The trouble is that shutdown doesn't resolve anything. The conflict that triggered it is still there. The emotions you've locked away are still there. They don't disappear. They just get suppressed. And when the shutdown lifts hours or days later, nothing has been processed. The issue remains unresolved. The pattern repeats. And over time, the threshold for shutdown lowers. What once required intense conflict now gets triggered by minor disagreements. The protective response becomes so sensitive that it fires at the slightest sign of emotional intensity. This destroys trust. Relationships require the ability to stay present through difficulty, to work through conflict without disappearing. But if every hard conversation ends in shutdown, the other person stops trying. They learn that raising issues leads to abandonment, so they stop raising them. The problems accumulate, the distance grows, and the shutdown, initially a defense against overwhelm, becomes the thing that ensures you'll never develop the capacity to handle conflict without it. Social Anhedonia. The party invitation arrives. You should feel something. Excitement, maybe. At least mild interest. But there's nothing. The idea of going, of being around people, talking, laughing, connecting, it doesn't appeal. Not because you're anxious. Not because you dislike the people. Because social interaction, the thing most people find rewarding, doesn't feel rewarding to you. It feels like work. Effort without payoff. This is social anhedonia. The inability to derive pleasure from social experiences. It's not the same as introversion, where socializing is draining but still occasionally enjoyable. Here, the reward mechanism itself is broken. The brain's response to social connection, the release of dopamine that makes interaction feel good, doesn't fire properly. You go through the motions. You can engage, but the internal experience is flat. You're performing sociability without feeling the benefit. For most people, social connection is intrinsically motivating. A good conversation, a shared laugh, the warmth of being around people you care about, these things feel good. They're self-reinforcing. But when the reward system is impaired, those experiences stop registering as positive. They become neutral at best. And when something stops feeling rewarding, the motivation to pursue it fades. Why put in the effort if there's no emotional return? This creates a slow withdrawal from social life. You stop initiating. You decline invitations. You let relationships drift, not out of hostility, not because you've been hurt, simply because the cost-benefit analysis doesn't add up. Socializing requires energy. It demands attention, engagement, emotional labor. And if none of that produces the warm, connected feeling it's supposed to, why bother? You're not getting what other people get from it. So you stop trying. The isolation that results isn't painful in the way loneliness usually is. You're not aching for connection. You're just alone. And the aloneness doesn't feel wrong. It feels neutral, which is part of what makes the condition so insidious. The absence of distress means there's no internal signal pushing you to reconnect. You drift further into isolation, and it doesn't hurt. It just is. What makes this particularly difficult to address is that the very thing that might help social connection is the thing that feels pointless. Rebuilding social ties requires effort. Sustained effort, with no immediate reward. You're asked to invest in something that doesn't feel good in the hope that eventually, maybe, it will. But when the Anhedonia is entrenched, that hope feels abstract. Distant, not compelling enough to override the inertia. So the isolation persists. And the longer it lasts, the more the social muscles atrophy, making re-engagement even harder when, or if, the motivation ever returns. Emotional withdrawal. It doesn't happen all at once. You don't wake up one day and decide to stop caring. It's gradual, a slow retreat. You pull back a little, then a little more. Each time someone asks how you're doing, you give less. Each time a conversation turns personal, you redirect. Each time vulnerability is expected, you withhold. And over time, the distance you've created becomes the new baseline. You've withdrawn. And no one, including you, noticed it happening until it was already done. This kind of withdrawal operates as self-preservation. At some point, being emotionally present became too costly. Maybe people used your openness against you. Maybe vulnerability led to rejection. Maybe the emotional labor of maintaining closeness exhausted you. So you started rationing, giving less, keeping more to yourself. And what began as a temporary pullback hardened into a permanent stance. The mechanics are invisible. You're still there, still showing up, still participating in the relationship. But the emotional investment has drained out. You go through the expected routines. The check-ins, the conversations, the gestures of care. But they're hollow. You're performing connection without offering the substance of it. The other person talks, and you listen. But you're not absorbing it. You're not carrying it with you. It passes through you and disappears. People notice eventually. They describe feeling shut out. Like they're talking to a version of you that's present but unavailable. They reach for intimacy and find nothing there. And the more they notice, the more they push for re-engagement, which triggers further withdrawal. Because the pressure to open up, to give more, to be emotionally available, feels like exactly the demand you were trying to escape by pulling back in the first place. The withdrawal becomes self-reinforcing. The less you give, the more people push. The more they push, the more you retreat. And the cycle tightens until the relationship exists only in form, not in function. You're connected by history, by routine, by shared logistics. But the emotional thread that once held it together has frayed to nothing. And by the time you realize what's been lost, the distance between where you are and where the relationship used to be feels too vast to cross. What makes this particularly damaging is how justified it feels. You're not being cruel. You're not trying to hurt anyone. You're just protecting yourself, conserving your resources, maintaining boundaries, all of which sounds reasonable, healthy even. But protection taken too far becomes isolation. And isolation, sustained long enough, becomes the thing you need protection from. The walls you built to keep harm out have also locked connection out. And once you're fully withdrawn, re-engaging requires dismantling the very defenses that have been keeping you stable. Which feels too risky, so you stay withdrawn. Witness desensitization. The first time you see someone in severe distress, it shakes you. The crying, the panic, the raw, unfiltered suffering. Your body responds, your heart races. You want to help, to comfort, to make it stop. But the 100th time, the 1000th time, it doesn't hit the same way. You've seen it too often. The alarm bells that used to ring now stay silent. You register the distress. You respond to it professionally. But the emotional jolt is gone. This happens to people whose work puts them in constant proximity to suffering. Paramedics, nurses, social workers, therapists, police officers, anyone whose job requires witnessing pain on a regular basis. The first cases affect them deeply. But the brain, efficient as always, adapts. It can't sustain that level of emotional activation every single day. So it recalibrates. The empathic response weakens. The distress becomes background noise. And what was once unbearable becomes routine. It's not callousness. At least not at first. It's adaptation. A necessary one even. If every patient's pain hit you with full emotional force, you'd burn out in weeks. The desensitization allows you to function. To stay composed. To do the work that needs doing without being paralyzed by the emotional weight of it. You're not ignoring the suffering. You're processing it differently. Cognitively, not emotionally. And that shift is what keeps you operational. But the line between functional detachment and genuine indifference is thin. And the longer you're exposed, the harder it becomes to tell which side you're on. The detachment that started as a professional tool begins to bleed into your personal life. You find yourself less moved by things that should move you. A friend's crisis doesn't land the way it used to. A tragic news story passes without impact. You've trained yourself to manage distress by not fully feeling it. And now you can't turn that training off when you're off the clock. The people around you notice. They describe you as cold, unresponsive, like you don't care, and you do care. Or at least you think you do. But the emotional signal that would prove it, that would make your care visible, isn't firing. It's been dampened by repetition. And what was once a survival mechanism has become a barrier between you and the emotional life you used to have access to. Recovery, if it happens, requires deliberate effort. You have to rebuild the sensitivity that prolonged exposure wore down, which means allowing yourself to feel the things you've been trained to deflect. And that's painful, overwhelming even. The very reason the desensitization developed in the first place. So most people don't try. They accept the blunted response as the cost of the work. And they live with the quiet knowledge that something essential, some capacity for emotional resonance, has been eroded in the process. Empathy suppression. You could feel it. The pull to care, to connect, to let their pain matter to you. But you don't. Not because you can't. Because you've chosen not to. You recognize the moment, the opening for empathy, and you deliberately shut it down. You turn away. You distance yourself. You refuse to let it in. This isn't a deficit. It's a strategy, a conscious decision to block empathic response when allowing it would be inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly. Maybe feeling for them would require action you don't want to take. Maybe their pain would complicate a decision you've already made. Maybe caring would open you up to guilt, to obligation, to the emotional messiness of actually being affected by someone else's suffering. So you suppress it. You cut the connection before it forms. The mechanics are deliberate. You shift focus. You rationalize. You remind yourself of reasons not to care. They brought this on themselves. They're exaggerating. It's not your problem. The mental maneuvers that let you sidestep the empathic pull. And the more you practice this, the easier it becomes. What starts as a conscious effort, a deliberate suppression, becomes automatic. You stop even noticing the moments where empathy could have emerged. You've trained yourself to bypass them entirely. This is common in contexts where empathy is perceived as weakness. In competitive environments. In hierarchical structures where caring for subordinates might slow you down. In situations where emotional distance is valued over connection. You learn that suppressing empathy gives you an edge. It lets you make hard decisions without the drag of guilt. It keeps you focused on outcomes rather than on the people affected by those outcomes. And the rewards reinforce the behavior. You advance. You succeed, and the suppression becomes part of your operational toolkit. But empathy suppression has costs. The same mechanism that lets you block uncomfortable feelings also diminishes your capacity for connection. You can't selectively suppress empathy only in the moments it's inconvenient. The skill generalizes. You get better at not feeling, and that improved skill shows up everywhere. In your personal relationships. In moments that should move you. In interactions where genuine care would strengthen the bond. The suppression you deployed strategically becomes a pervasive pattern, and the people closest to you start to feel the absence of something they can't quite name. The risk is permanence. What began as a choice, a tactical suppression, can erode into a fixed trait. You suppress empathy so often, for so long, that the capacity itself weakens. The neural pathways that support empathic response, under-used, begin to atrophy. And eventually, you're not suppressing anymore. You're just not feeling it. The deliberate block becomes an actual absence. And the person who once made a strategic choice to care less finds they can no longer care more, even when they want to. Instrumental coldness. You need something from them. Information, access, cooperation. So you engage. You're charming when it's useful, warm when it serves a purpose. But the moment they stop being helpful, the warmth disappears. You're not angry. You're not disappointed. You're just done. They've served their function. And now they're irrelevant. This is instrumental coldness. Treating people as tools rather than individuals. Not out of malice. Out of efficiency. Emotion gets in the way of objectives. Caring complicates decision-making. So you strip it out. You interact strategically. You build relationships with a specific outcome in mind. And when that outcome is achieved, or when it becomes clear it won't be, you move on. No sentimentality. No lingering attachment. Just a clean transactional exit. It shows up in professional settings, in networking, in environments where relationships are valued primarily for what they produce. You're not faking warmth. You're deploying it. The interest you show is real in the moment. But it's conditional, contingent on utility. And the second that utility fades, so does the interest. The person who felt valued yesterday feels discarded today. Not because they did anything wrong. Because they stopped being useful. The skill develops through reinforcement. You learn that emotional investment in people who can't help you is wasted energy. That loyalty to those who don't advance your goals slows you down. That treating relationships as means rather than ends yields better results. And the more that approach works, the more entrenched it becomes. The coldness isn't a flaw to correct. It's a competitive advantage to cultivate. But this creates a reputation. People learn not to trust your warmth. They recognize the calculation behind it. They see the way you drop people once they've outlived their usefulness. And they protect themselves. They engage with you transactionally because that's the only mode you've made available. The relationships you build are fragile, conditional. And the moment you need something from someone you've previously discarded, you discover that instrumental coldness works both ways. They remember. And they respond in kind. What makes this particularly corrosive is how invisible it is to the person deploying it. You're not cruel. You're practical. You're not cold. You're focused. You've framed the behavior in terms that justify it. Efficiency, professionalism, prioritization. And those frames insulate you from recognizing the pattern for what it is. A systematic reduction of people to their utility. A refusal to value anyone beyond what they can provide. And a growing isolation as the people around you learn that your warmth, no matter how convincing, is always for sale. Blunted guilt response. You hurt someone. You know it. You see the impact. But the feeling that should follow, the discomfort, the urge to make it right, it doesn't arrive. You understand, intellectually, that you've caused harm. But the emotional weight that should accompany that understanding is absent. No guilt. No remorse. Just a mild awareness that something happened and you were involved. This is what it looks like when the guilt response is impaired. For most people, causing harm triggers an internal alarm. Guilt, shame, regret. The emotional discomfort that signals, this was wrong, fix it. That discomfort is what motivates apology, repair, behavior change. But when the response is blunted, the signal doesn't fire. Or it fires so weakly that it's easy to ignore. You know you should feel bad. You just don't. And without the feeling, the motivation to correct the harm evaporates. This can develop in several ways. Sometimes it's neurological. The circuitry that generates guilt doesn't function properly. Sometimes it's environmental. Repeated exposure to situations where guilt would be overwhelming leads the brain to dampen the response as protection. Either way, the outcome is the same. Harm caused doesn't produce the internal consequences that would normally regulate behavior. You do something wrong, and the emotional cost that would typically stop you from doing it again simply isn't there. In relationships, this breakdown is catastrophic. Trust depends on the belief that the other person will feel bad if they hurt you. That guilt will drive them to avoid causing harm and to repair it when it happens. But when the guilt response is blunted, that mechanism fails. You hurt them. They wait for the apology, the acknowledgement, the effort to make it right. It doesn't come, not because you're defiant, because you're not feeling the thing that would drive those actions. And the absence of guilt reads, to them, as indifference, as proof that their pain doesn't matter to you. The danger is in how this compounds. Without guilt to regulate behavior, the harmful actions repeat. Each time, the expectation for remorse goes unmet. And each unmet expectation erodes trust further. The relationship deteriorates not from a single betrayal, but from the ongoing reality that harm, once caused, carries no emotional consequence for the person who caused it. They're free to hurt you again because they never felt bad about hurting you the first time. Recovery requires external structure, rules, consequences, systems that impose the accountability that guilt would normally provide internally. But those external structures are fragile. They work only as long as they're enforced. And the person operating without guilt learns to navigate them, to avoid punishment without actually changing the behavior. Because the internal motivator, the one that would make change feel necessary rather than just strategically useful, is missing. And without it, the pattern of harm continues, regulated only by what can be externally controlled, not by what's internally felt. Reduced affective resonance. They're excited, genuinely, visibly thrilled, and you're watching them, trying to match it, trying to feel the echo of their joy. But nothing comes. You see their happiness. You recognize it, but it doesn't resonate. It doesn't spark a similar feeling in you. You're emotionally flat while they're lit up. And the gap between what they're experiencing and what you're able to reflect back to them grows more obvious with every failed attempt to bridge it. This is reduced affective resonance. The inability to emotionally mirror what someone else is feeling. It's not the same as lacking empathy in the cognitive sense. You can understand that they're happy. You can predict how they'll behave. You can even care in an abstract way about their well-being. But the automatic emotional mirroring, the resonance that makes their feelings partially yours, doesn't happen. Their emotions remain theirs. And you remain detached, observing rather than sharing. The mechanism is neurological. Mirror neurons, the systems that support emotional contagion, don't fire as they should. When most people see someone smile, their brain activates the same regions involved in smiling, creating a felt sense of the other person's happiness. But when resonance is reduced, that activation doesn't occur. The observation remains purely cognitive. You process their emotion as information, not as an experience to be shared. This creates a relational asymmetry. The other person feels their emotions amplified through connection. Sharing joy doubles it. Sharing grief halves it. That's the promise of emotional resonance. But when you can't resonate, that promise breaks. They share their excitement, expecting you to catch some of it. You don't. They share their pain, expecting you to carry part of it. You can't. And over time, they stop sharing. Because sharing emotions with someone who can't feel them back is exhausting. It's performing for an audience that isn't reacting. The isolation this creates isn't loud. You're still in the relationship, still present, still participating. But there's a dimension of connection missing. The emotional feedback loop that makes interaction feel reciprocal doesn't close. They give. You receive. But you can't give back in the same currency. And that one-sidedness, sustained over time, wears the relationship thin. They feel alone with you. Not because you're absent. Because you're present but unreachable. They're in body but not in emotional resonance. What compounds the problem is that reduced resonance often comes with reduced awareness of the deficit. You don't feel the absence of something you've never reliably experienced. You might notice that relationships feel effortful, that people seem dissatisfied with your responses. But the specific mechanism, the failure to emotionally mirror, stays invisible. You're trying. You're engaging. You just can't generate the resonance they're waiting for. And without understanding why, the pattern repeats. Connection attempted, resonance expected, resonance absent, distance widened. Defensive numbing. The pain was too much, so you stopped feeling it. Not consciously. Not as a decision, but as an automatic protective response. Your mind, overwhelmed by emotional intensity it couldn't process, shut the whole system down. And what's left is a strange, muted existence. You're not in pain anymore. But you're not feeling much of anything else either. Defensive numbing operates as a circuit breaker. When emotional input exceeds capacity, the system cuts power to prevent total collapse. It's adaptive in the short term, a way to survive unbearable circumstances without being destroyed by them. But it's indiscriminate. It doesn't selectively block the painful emotions while leaving the pleasant ones intact. It dampens everything. Joy, connection, excitement, they all get muted alongside the pain. And what you're left with is a pervasive flatness. A dull, grey existence where nothing hits hard enough to matter. This shows up after trauma, after prolonged stress, after grief so intense the mind can't hold it without breaking. The numbing descends like fog. Slowly. Quietly. You don't notice it happening until it's already in place. And once it's there, it doesn't lift easily. The system that shut down to protect you doesn't automatically reboot once the threat has passed. It stays offline, and you stay numb. People describe it as living in a fog, as watching life happen from behind a barrier. You go through the motions. You show up. You function. But the emotional texture that used to give life meaning is gone. A sunset that once moved you now just looks like light. A conversation that used to energize you now feels like effort without reward. The numbness has flattened everything into the same dull register. And the loss of emotional range feels, paradoxically, like a relief and a prison at the same time. Relationships suffer because emotional presence is what holds them together. And when you're numb, you can't be emotionally present. You're there, but you're not really there. The other person reeks for connection and finds nothing to connect to. They share joy, and it doesn't land. They express pain, and you can't access the empathy that would let you respond meaningfully. You're not withholding. You're just locked out of your own emotional system. And the person trying to reach you eventually stops trying. The risk is permanence. Defensive numbing, employed long enough, can become structural. The neural pathways that support emotional responsiveness, underoos, begin to weaken. What started as a temporary shutdown hardens into a lasting state. And the longer you stay numb, the harder it becomes to remember what feeling used to be like, or to believe that returning to it is even possible. The protection becomes the problem. And the very mechanism that kept you safe now keeps you isolated, disconnected, and unable to access the full range of human experience. Selective indifference. You care about some things, deeply, passionately even. But other things that should matter, that most people would feel something about, leave you completely unmoved. It's not that you're incapable of caring. You're just highly selective about where you direct. And once you've decided something doesn't matter to you, no amount of reasoning, no appeal to empathy, no social pressure can make you care. This isn't apathy. Apathy is universal indifference. This is targeted, strategic even. You've decided, consciously or not, what deserves your emotional investment and what doesn't. And the things that fall outside that boundary simply don't register as significant. Other people's concerns about them feel irrelevant. Their expectation that you should care feels like an imposition. You've allocated your capacity for concern, and there's no room left for the things they think should matter. The pattern often develops as self-preservation. Caring about everything is exhausting, impossible even. So you narrow your focus. You decide what's worth your energy and what isn't, and you enforce that boundary rigidly. The problem is that the boundaries you draw don't always align with what the people around you need from you. They need you to care about their struggles, about social issues, about problems that don't directly affect you, and your selective indifference to those things reads to them as coldness, as selfishness, as proof that you don't value what they value. What makes this particularly difficult to address is how justified it feels. You're not obligated to care about everything. You're allowed to prioritize. To focus your concern on what matters most to you. And that's true. But selective indifference becomes a problem when it creates relational damage. When the things you've decided not to care about are things that the people in your life need you to care about. Your partner's career struggles. Your friends' political concerns. Issues that, while not central to your life, are central to theirs. And your refusal to extend care to those areas fractures the relationship. The indifference hardens over time. What starts as a boundary becomes a wall. You get used to dismissing certain categories of concern, and the dismissal becomes automatic. You don't even consider whether this particular instance might be worth your attention. You've already filed it under "not my problem," and that categorization shuts down any further engagement. The person asking for your care doesn't get a fair hearing. They get a reflexive dismissal, and the message that sends, whether you intend it or not, is that they and what matters to them don't matter to you. The cost shows up in isolation. People stop bringing things to you. They learn that unless it fits within your narrow band of interest, you won't engage. So they take their concerns elsewhere. To people who will care. And you're left with relationships that function only within the limited scope you've allowed. Anything outside that scope gets excluded. And the relationships, constrained by your selectivity, never develop the depth or breadth that comes from caring about what the other person cares about, even when it's not naturally your concern. Relational detachment. You're in the relationship, but you're not of it. You go through the routines, the dinners, the check-ins, the rituals that mark connection. But underneath, there's a distance that never closes. You're participating without fully inhabiting the role, present but fundamentally unavailable. And the other person, trying to reach you, keeps hitting a wall they can't see but can always feel. This kind of detachment isn't about physical absence. It's emotional. You're there in body. You respond when spoken to. You fulfill obligations. But the emotional thread that should tie you to the other person, that should make their well-being matter to you in a visceral way, is missing. Or so thin it barely registers. You care in theory, but the felt sense of caring, the one that drives spontaneous affection, active concern, genuine investment, doesn't show up. And the relationship, stripped of that emotional substrate, becomes a hollow performance. The detachment often develops gradually. A protective pullback after hurt. A strategic distancing to maintain autonomy. A defensive reflex against vulnerability. Whatever the origin, the pattern is the same. You create space. And once that space exists, it's easier to maintain than to close. Staying detached requires no effort. It's the default. Reconnecting, letting someone back in, dropping the guard, that's the hard part. So you stay detached. And the relationship continues, but only at the surface. What this does to the other person is slow erosion. They feel the absence of something essential but can't always name it. You're doing the right things, showing up, being reliable. But the warmth, the spontaneity, the sense that you're genuinely invested in them, not just in the structure of the relationship, is missing. They reach for intimacy and find formality. They offer vulnerability and get politeness. And over time, they stop reaching. Because trying to connect with someone who's fundamentally detached is like trying to hold onto smoke. The form is there. The substance isn't. The detachment creates a paradox. You stay in the relationship, which suggests commitment. But you withhold the emotional presence that would make the relationship meaningful, which undermines that commitment. You're loyal in action but absent in feeling. And the other person is left in a strange limbo. Not quite alone. Not quite connected. They have a partner, but they don't have access to the person they're partnered with. The relationship exists, but the emotional core of it has been hollowed out by your refusal or inability to fully inhabit it. Breaking the pattern requires risk. You'd have to drop the detachment, let the person in, allow yourself to be affected by them in ways you've been avoiding. And that feels dangerous, because detachment is protection. It keeps you safe from the pain that comes with genuine investment. But it also keeps you safe from the connection, the intimacy, the depth that makes relationships worth having in the first place. And the longer you stay detached, the harder it becomes to remember why you'd ever choose vulnerability over safety. The distance that once felt protective now feels permanent. And the relationship, such as it is, continues in name only. Cruelty normalisation. The first time you witness casual cruelty, it shocks you. Someone mocking a stranger. A colleague openly belittling another. A small act of meanness delivered without hesitation. You expect discomfort. Pushback. Something. But everyone else just carries on. And slowly, imperceptibly, so do you. What once registered as wrong starts to feel ordinary. Not because you've decided it's acceptable. Because you've seen it so many times it's stopped triggering a reaction. This is how cruelty becomes normalized. Through repetition. Through exposure. Through the steady erosion of the alarm that should fire when harm happens in front of you. The first instance jolts you. The 10th makes you uneasy. The 100th barely registers. And by the time you've witnessed it enough, it's not cruelty anymore. It's just how people behave. The baseline has shifted, and what should feel unacceptable now feels inevitable. The process is gradual. No single moment marks the transition. You don't wake up one day having decided that cruelty is fine. You just stop noticing it as sharply. The comments that used to make you wince now pass without reaction. The behavior that once seemed obviously wrong now seems like normal social friction. You've been desensitized. Not through a conscious choice. Through sheer volume of exposure. What makes this particularly insidious is that normalization doesn't just change how you react to cruelty. It changes how you participate in it. When cruelty is everywhere, when it's treated as unremarkable, the cost of engaging in it yourself drops. You make the cutting remark. You join the pile on. You let the small cruelty pass your lips because everyone else is doing it, and no one seems to think it's a problem. The line you thought you'd never cross gets crossed casually. And the crossing doesn't feel like a moral failure. It feels like fitting in. The environments where this happens most are the ones where cruelty serves a function. Workplaces where tearing people down is treated as competitive edge. Social groups where mockery is the currency of belonging. Online spaces where cruelty is entertainment. In those contexts, the normalization accelerates. Because not only are you seeing cruelty repeatedly, you're seeing it rewarded. The person who delivers the sharpest insult gets the laugh. The one who shows no mercy gets respect. And the message is clear. This is how you succeed here. This is how you belong. And once cruelty is normalized, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. The moral intuition that would flag it as wrong has been dulled. The social pressure that would discourage it has evaporated. You're operating in an environment where the only cost of cruelty is not being cruel enough. And the people who object, who still react with discomfort, get dismissed as too sensitive, too soft, unable to handle the culture. The normalization is complete. And the cruelty, now fully embedded, continues unchecked. Compassion avoidance. Someone's in pain, real visible distress. And your first instinct isn't to help. It's to look away, to create distance, to avoid engaging with their suffering because allowing yourself to feel it would cost you something you're not willing to pay. So you don't. You turn your attention elsewhere. You keep walking. You scroll past. And the moment passes without you having to feel the pull of their pain. This is compassion avoidance. The deliberate refusal to engage with others suffering because compassion, once activated, demands something from you. Attention. Emotional labor. Action. And if you're already stretched thin, if caring would add weight you can't carry, the instinct is to avoid triggering the response in the first place. Don't look too closely. Don't let it in. Don't allow the suffering to register as something you're responsible for addressing. The avoidance operates as self-protection. Compassion is costly. It requires you to absorb some portion of another person's pain, to let it affect you, to feel moved enough to do something about it. And if you're already managing your own struggles, if your emotional reserves are depleted, taking on someone else's pain feels impossible. So you shield yourself. You disengage before the compassion even has a chance to form. And the person in distress remains unseen. Their suffering acknowledged, maybe, but not felt. What compounds this is the volume of suffering visible in modern life. The news, social media, appeals for help from strangers and acquaintances alike. The sheer quantity of pain demanding your attention is overwhelming. And if you let yourself feel compassion for all of it, you'd be crushed under the weight. So you develop filters. You decide which suffering deserves your compassion and which doesn't. And the rest gets avoided. Not out of cruelty. Out of necessity. You can't carry it all. So you carry none of it. But avoidance comes with costs. The more you practice turning away from suffering, the easier it becomes. The reflex to disengage strengthens. And eventually the avoidance becomes automatic. You're no longer making conscious decisions about which suffering to engage with. You're reflexively avoiding all of it. The compassion that once would have risen naturally now requires deliberate effort to access. An effort when you're already depleted feels like too much to ask. The isolation this creates is mutual. The person suffering doesn't get the support they need. And you, avoiding their pain to protect yourself, lose access to the very thing that makes connection meaningful. Compassion isn't just about helping others. It's about allowing yourself to be moved by them. To be affected. To care. And when you systematically avoid that, you're not just protecting yourself from pain. You're cutting yourself off from the emotional depth that makes relationships matter. The avoidance keeps you safe, but it also keeps you alone. Emotional minimalism. You keep your emotions small, controlled, carefully rationed. Joy gets tempered before it can build. Sadness gets cut off before it deepens. Anger gets smoothed out before it flares. You operate in a narrow emotional band, never too high, never too low, always measured. It's not suppression. It's minimization, a deliberate practice of keeping feelings contained so they never reach the intensity that would make them difficult to manage. This develops as a control strategy. Big emotions feel dangerous. They make you vulnerable. They cloud judgment. They create complications. So you learn to keep them small, to regulate them down before they can escalate. And over time, the minimization becomes your baseline. You don't just reduce emotions when they threaten to get out of hand. You reduce them preemptively. You live in a state of emotional restraint, not because you're incapable of feeling more, but because allowing yourself to feel more feels risky. The mechanics are subtle. You don't deny the emotion. You acknowledge it, but you don't let it expand. You feel the initial flicker of excitement and immediately temper it. It's good, but let's not get carried away. You notice the sadness rising and redirect your attention before it fully forms. You recognize the anger and talk yourself down before it gains momentum. The emotion exists. You just keep it small enough to stay manageable. And manageable, in your framework, means safe. What this creates is a life of muted experience. The highs aren't as high. The lows aren't as low. Everything stays moderate, predictable, under control. And on the surface, that looks like emotional stability. You're not volatile. You're not reactive. You're calm, composed. But underneath, there's a cost. The richness of emotional experience, the fullness of feeling something deeply, gets sacrificed for the sake of control. You're stable, but you're also diminished. Relationships struggle under emotional minimalism. Connection requires emotional availability. It requires letting yourself feel things fully. Celebrating with someone means letting joy rise without immediately cutting it down. Comforting someone means letting their pain touch you without reflexively minimizing it. But when you've trained yourself to keep emotions small, you can't turn that off selectively. The minimization applies everywhere, and the person trying to connect with you feels the restraint. They share something significant, and your response is measured, controlled, small. And the gap between what they're offering and what you're able to return grows too wide to bridge. The practice, sustained long enough, becomes identity. You're not someone who minimizes emotions. You're someone who doesn't feel things intensely. The distinction matters. Because if it's identity, if you've internalized the minimalism as who you are rather than what you do, changing it requires more than adjusting behavior. It requires rethinking your entire relationship to emotion. And that feels too destabilizing. So you stay minimal, safe, controlled, and increasingly isolated from the full range of human experience. Disengaged concern. You care in theory. You're worried about them in principle. But the concern stays abstract. You think about their problem. You acknowledge it's serious, but you don't do anything about it. The gap between caring and acting is wide. And you stay on the caring side, never crossing into the action that concern would normally demand. This is disengaged concern. The experience of feeling worried or troubled by someone's situation while remaining functionally uninvolved in addressing it. It's not apathy. Apathy would be indifference. This is care without follow-through. Concern that stops short of commitment. You genuinely feel troubled by their struggle. You just don't let that feeling translate into the effort it would take to help. The disengagement serves a purpose. Acting on concern is costly. It requires time, energy, emotional investment. And if you're already managing your own demands, adding someone else's problems to your plate feels overwhelming. So you contain the concern. You let yourself feel it, which satisfies the sense that you're a good person who cares. But you don't let it escalate into action, which protects you from the burden that helping would create. The concern stays theoretical, and you stay uninvolved. What makes this particularly difficult to confront is how reasonable it feels. You can't help everyone. You're allowed to have limits. You're not obligated to solve other people's problems, all of which is true. But disengaged concern becomes a problem when it's applied to people who genuinely need you. Your partner, your close friend, your family, the people whose struggles should activate more than abstract worry. When the concern stays disengaged even in those relationships, it signals that caring for you is an emotion you experience rather than a responsibility you act on. The person on the receiving end notices. They tell you what they're going through. You express concern. You say you're worried. You ask how they're doing. But you don't offer help. You don't show up. You don't take the action that would demonstrate the concern is real. And over time, your words lose meaning. Concern without action is just noise. It's a performance of caring that doesn't actually help. And the person who needed you learns that your worry, however genuine it might feel to you, doesn't translate into the support they can rely on. The pattern reinforces itself. The more you practice disengaged concern, the wider the gap between feeling and action becomes. Caring stays in your head, and action stays out of reach. You tell yourself you'll help when things settle down, when you have more capacity, when the timing is better. But the timing is never better. The capacity never increases. And the concern, perpetually disengaged, becomes a substitute for the actual involvement that relationships require. You care. You're just not there. And the distance between those two states is where the relationship slowly erodes. Inhibited affection. You want to reach out, to touch their shoulder, to say something warm, but you don't. The impulse is there. The affection is real, but something stops it before it reaches the surface. You hold back. You keep it contained. And the moment passes with the affection unspoken, unshown, locked inside where only you know it exists. This is inhibited affection, the suppression of warm, affectionate impulses that, if expressed, would strengthen connection. It's not that you don't feel fondness. You do. It's that expressing it feels too vulnerable, too exposing, too risky. So you keep it to yourself. And the person you care about never receives the signal that would tell them they matter to you. The inhibition often develops as protection. Maybe past expressions of affection were rejected. Maybe vulnerability led to hurt. Maybe showing warmth was met with indifference or mockery. So you learn to hold back, to keep the affection private, to protect yourself from the possibility that offering it might not be received the way you hope. And over time, the holding back becomes automatic. You stop even considering whether it's safe to show affection. You just don't. What this does to relationships is slow starvation. Affection is the fuel that keeps connection alive. The small gestures, the warm words, the touch that says, "I care about you." Without those signals, the relationship runs on empty. The other person doesn't know how you feel. They can't read your mind. And the affection you're holding back, no matter how genuine, doesn't count if it never gets expressed. They experience your restraint as coldness, as distance, as proof that you don't feel as much as they do. The irony is that inhibited affection often coexists with deep feeling. You care intensely. You feel warmth, fondness, even love, but the expression of it stays locked down. And the gap between what you feel and what you show creates a painful paradox. You're emotionally invested, but you appear detached. You want closeness, but your behavior creates distance. And the person you care about, interpreting your restraint as indifference, starts pulling back, which makes showing affection feel even riskier. And the cycle tightens. Breaking the pattern requires deliberate action. You have to override the impulse to hold back, to express the affection even when it feels uncomfortable, to risk the vulnerability that comes with showing warmth. But if the inhibition has been in place for years, if it's become your default mode of operating, that override feels impossible. The affection is there. You just can't get it out. And the relationships that could be sustained by that warmth, if only you could express it, slowly wither from the deprivation. Not because you don't care, because the caring never makes it past the barrier you've built to protect yourself. Pain desensitization. You've seen enough pain that it doesn't move you anymore. The crying, the suffering, the visible anguish. It's all familiar now. Background noise. You register it happening. But the emotional response that used to accompany that recognition is gone. You've adapted. And the adaptation, while useful in some contexts, has stripped away your ability to be genuinely affected by others' distress. This happens in professions that expose you to pain regularly. Healthcare, emergency response, social work, therapy. Any field where suffering is part of the daily landscape. The first patient in crisis affects you deeply. But by the 100th, the 1000th, the response has dulled. Not because you've become cruel, because the brain, efficient as always, has recalibrated. It can't sustain high-intensity emotional reactions to the same stimulus indefinitely. So it adjusts. The pain you witness becomes routine, and your response to it flattens. The desensitization is adaptive in the short term. It lets you function. To stay composed when someone needs you, to be steady rather than emotionally overwhelmed. To make clear decisions in moments of crisis. To do the work that needs doing without being paralyzed by the emotional weight of it. And in those contexts, the desensitization is necessary, functional, even protective. But it doesn't stay contained. The numbing that helps you manage pain at work doesn't switch off when you go home. You've trained your nervous system to downregulate its response to distress. And that training generalizes. A friend tells you about their struggle. You hear it. You understand it intellectually. But the emotional resonance, the gut-level reaction that says, "This matters, this is serious," doesn't fire. You've been desensitized. And now the desensitization applies everywhere. Not just to the pain you see professionally, but to the pain of people you actually care about. The people in your personal life notice. They describe you as detached, unresponsive, like their pain doesn't register with you the way it should. And they're right. It doesn't, not because you don't care, but because the mechanism that would let you feel their pain alongside them has been worn down by repetition. You've seen too much suffering. And the cost of that exposure is the erosion of your capacity to be moved by it. Recovery, if it happens, requires deliberate recalibration. You have to rebuild the sensitivity that prolonged exposure dulled, which means allowing yourself to feel the distress you've been trained to deflect. And that's painful, overwhelming, even. The very thing the desensitization was protecting you from. So most people don't try. They accept the blunted response as the cost of the work they do. And they live with the knowledge that something essential, some capacity for emotional resonance with pain, has been permanently altered. The desensitization that helped them survive their job has made it harder to fully connect with the people who need them to feel, not just observe their suffering. Cynical distance. Everyone's got an angle. Every kind gesture hides a motive. Every expression of care is really just self-interest dressed up as compassion. You've seen enough to know better than to take anything at face value. So you don't. You keep your distance. You watch people with suspicion. And the warmth they offer, if they offer it at all, gets filtered through your certainty that it's never what it appears to be. This cynical distance operates as protection. If you assume everyone's acting out of self-interest, you can't be caught off guard when they inevitably are. If you treat every relationship as transactional, you're prepared when it turns out to be exactly that. The cynicism shields you from disappointment, from betrayal, from the pain of trusting someone who doesn't deserve it. And in a world where trust is frequently misplaced, that shield feels justified. But cynicism doesn't just protect you from being hurt. It prevents connection from forming in the first place. When you approach every interaction with the assumption the other person's motives are corrupt, you never give the relationship a chance to develop past suspicion. Someone does something kind, and instead of accepting it, you immediately start looking for the hidden cost. They express concern, and you dismiss it as performance. They offer help, and you interpret it as manipulation. The cynicism creates a wall that no genuine gesture can penetrate, because you've decided in advance that genuine doesn't exist. The distance this creates is self-fulfilling. People pick up on your suspicion. They feel the way you scrutinize their motives, and they respond by pulling back, by being less open, by offering less of themselves because they can sense it won't be received as intended anyway. And their withdrawal confirms what you already believed. See, everyone's out for themselves. The fact that your cynicism pushed them away doesn't register. You just see the evidence that people aren't trustworthy. And the cycle continues. What makes cynical distance particularly corrosive is how it masquerades as wisdom. You're not bitter. You're realistic. You're not closed off. You're just not naive. You've framed your suspicion as insight. And that framing makes it nearly impossible to challenge. Because questioning the cynicism requires accepting that maybe you've been wrong. That maybe some gestures are genuine. That maybe the distance you've maintained has cost you more than it's protected you from. And that possibility feels too risky to entertain. The isolation deepens quietly. Relationships stay shallow because you won't let them go deeper. Trust never forms because you've decided it's foolish. And the warmth that could have existed between you and others gets extinguished by your refusal to believe it's real. The cynicism keeps you safe. But it also keeps you alone. Insulated from harm, and equally insulated from connection. Flattened affect. Your face doesn't move much. Your voice stays level. When you speak, there's no variation in tone, no shift in expression, no visible sign of what you're feeling underneath. You could be excited. You could be miserable. From the outside, it all looks the same. A flat, unchanging presentation that gives nothing away. This flattening of affect isn't a performance. It's not a deliberate choice to hide emotion. It's the absence of the expressive mechanisms that would normally translate internal states into visible signals. The emotion might be there, but the outward display is minimal. Your face doesn't reflect what you feel. Your voice doesn't modulate in response to content. And the result is a presentation that reads, to others, as emotionally absent. For some, the flattening is neurological. The systems that support emotional expression don't function as they should. For others, it's a learned suppression that's become so habitual it's automatic. Either way, the outcome is the same. You exist in a narrow expressive range, and the people trying to read you can't. They're looking for cues that aren't there, waiting for signals that don't come. and the absence of those cues leaves them guessing. What this does to interaction is subtle but significant. Communication relies on more than words. It relies on the feedback loop of expression and response. A smile invites warmth. A frown signals concern. A shift in tone conveys emphasis. When those signals are missing, the other person is left without the information they need to gauge how the conversation is going. They can't tell if you're engaged or bored, pleased or disappointed, comfortable or uneasy. And that uncertainty makes interaction exhausting. The flattening also affects how you're perceived. People interpret the absence of expression as coldness, as detachment, as proof that you don't care as much as they do. They share something important, and your face doesn't change. They make a joke, and you don't react. And over time, they stop trying to connect. Because connecting with someone who gives nothing back expressively feels like talking to a wall. The effort doesn't generate the response that makes it worthwhile. What compounds the problem is that flattened affect often coexists with genuine feeling. You care. You're moved. You're engaged. But none of that shows, and the gap between what you feel and what you display creates a painful disconnect. You're emotionally present, but you appear absent, and the people around you, unable to see past the flatness, assume the absence is real. The relationships you want, the connections you value, slowly erode. Not because you don't feel, because what you feel never makes it to the surface where others can see it. Interpersonal blunting. You used to feel things more sharply. The pull of connection, the warmth of closeness, the sting when someone pulled away. But somewhere along the way, the edges dulled, the intensity faded, and now when you interact with people, the emotional texture that used to accompany those interactions is muted. You're present. You're engaged. But the feeling that should be there, the resonance that makes interaction feel meaningful, is blunted. This blunting is specific to interpersonal contexts. Other emotions might still fire normally. You can feel excitement about an accomplishment, frustration with a problem, satisfaction from completing a task. But when it comes to people, to relationships, to the emotional back and forth that defines connection, the response is dampened. You care, in theory, but the felt sense of caring, the one that drives you to reach out, to invest, to stay connected, doesn't activate the way it used to. The blunting often develops as protection. Maybe relationships caused too much pain. Maybe the emotional investment became too costly. Maybe the vulnerability required for genuine connection started to feel too dangerous, so the mind adjusted. It turned down the dial on interpersonal emotion. Not all the way. Just enough to make the interactions manageable, to reduce the risk, to keep the emotional cost low. But what starts as a protective dampening becomes a barrier to connection. Relationships require emotional reciprocity. The other person gives, and you give back. They invest, and you match that investment. But when your side of the exchange is blunted, the reciprocity breaks down. They reach for closeness, and you respond with a muted version of what they're offering. They share vulnerability, and you acknowledge it without fully feeling it. And the gap between what they're putting in and what they're getting back widens. Over time, they notice. They describe you as distant, unavailable, like you're going through the motions without actually being there. And they're right. You are going through the motions, because the blunting has stripped away the emotional drive that would make the investment feel natural. You're participating, but you're not fully inhabiting the interaction. And the relationships, deprived of the emotional fuel they need to thrive, slowly weaken. The blunting doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one day and realize the emotional response to people has faded. It happens gradually, imperceptibly. And by the time you notice, if you notice at all, the pattern is entrenched. The relationships you have exist in a diminished form, functional, polite, but lacking the depth and warmth that once made them feel worth maintaining. The blunting protected you from pain. But it also robbed you of the very thing that makes connection meaningful. And reversing it requires re-exposing yourself to the vulnerability you've been avoiding, which feels, at this point, impossible. Objectification. You stop seeing them as a person. They become a function, a role, a means to an end. The waiter is just there to bring your food. The colleague is just there to complete a task. The stranger on the street is just an obstacle to navigate around. You've stripped away their individuality, reduced them to their utility, and once that reduction happens, treating them poorly becomes easier. Because you're not mistreating a person. You're just managing an object. This is objectification, the psychological process of reducing someone from a complex individual with thoughts, feelings, and inner life to a simplified object defined by their use to you. It doesn't require conscious malice. It happens automatically. The brain, faced with the cognitive load of treating everyone as fully human, creates shortcuts. And those shortcuts involve categorizing people by function rather than recognizing them as individuals. The process accelerates in contexts where people are already dehumanized by structure. Service roles. Hierarchical relationships. Situations where someone's job is to serve you, to defer to you, to accommodate your needs. In those contexts, the functional relationship is built in. And it's easy to let the function become the entirety of how you see them. They're not a person with a life outside this interaction. They're the person who does this thing for you. And once that framing takes hold, their personhood becomes irrelevant. What makes objectification particularly insidious is how invisible it is to the person doing it. You don't think you're dehumanizing anyone. You're just interacting efficiently, treating the interaction as transactional because that's what it is. You're not being cruel. You're being practical. And that framing, that sense that objectification is just a neutral mode of operating, prevents you from recognizing the harm it causes. But the person being objectified feels it. They notice when you don't make eye contact, when you don't say thank you, when you treat them as invisible except when you need something from them. And that treatment, repeated across countless interactions, reinforces their sense of being disposable, of mattering only to the extent that they're useful. The objectification you deploy casually becomes, for them, a daily reminder that they're not seen as fully human. The danger is in how the pattern generalizes. Start objectifying people in one context, and the habit spreads. You begin treating everyone through the lens of utility. Partners become sources of companionship or support rather than whole people. Friends become social assets. Family becomes obligation. And the capacity to see people as valuable beyond what they provide to you erodes. The objectification that started as a shortcut becomes the default. And the relationships you maintain, hollowed out by your refusal to see the person behind the function, become transactional, conditional, empty. Dissociative detachment. You're there, but you're not really there. You're watching yourself go through the interaction from a distance. Like you're observing your own life rather than living it. The conversation is happening. You're responding. But there's a gap between you and the experience. A sense of being separated from your own presence. Detached. Floating. Not quite connected to the moment you're supposed to be in. This dissociative detachment operates as a defense mechanism. When reality becomes too overwhelming, when being fully present would mean confronting something unbearable, the mind creates distance. It disengages. You're still there physically, but psychologically you've stepped back. And from that removed position, the intensity of the moment dulls. The emotions that would hit hard if you were fully present stay at a distance. You're safe, but you're also disconnected. The detachment can be triggered by trauma, by extreme stress, by situations where full emotional presence would be too much to handle. And in those moments, the dissociation is adaptive. It's the mind protecting itself from overload. But the mechanism, once activated, doesn't always turn off. It becomes a reflex, a default response to discomfort, and what was once a crisis tool becomes a daily mode of operating. What this does to relationships is profound. Connection requires presence. It requires you to be fully there, emotionally available, engaged with the person in front of you. But when you're dissociated, when you're operating from that removed position, you can't offer that presence. You're going through the motions, saying the right things, but the core of you isn't accessible. The other person talks to you, and they're talking to a version of you that's only partially engaged. The rest of you is elsewhere, watching. Detect. They feel the absence. They describe it as talking to someone who's not really listening, who's physically present but emotionally gone. And they're right. You are gone. Not intentionally, not out of lack of care, but because the dissociation has pulled you out of full engagement. And the harder they try to reach you, the more you retreat into that detached observation. The pressure to be present triggers more dissociation, and the cycle deepens. Breaking the pattern requires re-engaging with the present moment, which means dropping the protective distance, allowing yourself to be fully there, with all the vulnerability and intensity that entails. But if dissociation has become your primary coping mechanism, if it's how you've been managing discomfort for years, choosing to stay present feels impossibly risky. The detachment keeps you safe, and safety at this point feels more important than connection. So you stay removed, watching your own life from a distance, present in body, absent in every way that matters. Psychic numbing. The scale of suffering becomes too large to process. Thousands dead, millions displaced. The numbers climb, and your emotional response doesn't scale with them. One person's tragedy moves you. 1,000 becomes a statistic, and 1,000,000 becomes so abstract it barely registers. The suffering is real. The scale is incomprehensible, and your capacity to feel proportionate concern collapses under the weight of it. This is psychic numbing, the phenomenon where mass suffering produces less emotional response than individual suffering. It's not apathy. It's a cognitive limitation. The human brain evolved to respond to individuals, to faces, to stories, to the person in front of you. But it struggles with scale. When the victims number in the thousands, the mind can't hold them all as individuals. It defaults to abstraction. And abstraction doesn't move us the way a single story does. The numbing shows up most clearly in responses to large-scale crises. A single child trapped in a well generates national attention. Thousands of children dying in a famine generate concern, but not the same visceral reaction. The emotional system can't process mass tragedy the way it processes individual tragedy. So it shuts down. The numbers get acknowledged, but the feeling that would normally accompany that acknowledgement, the horror, the urgency, the drive to help diminishes as the scale increases. What makes this particularly troubling is the practical consequence. Aid, intervention, public response. They all depend on people caring enough to act. But when the numbing kicks in, when large-scale suffering gets processed as abstract rather than visceral, the motivation to act weakens. You see the numbers. You understand intellectually that the need is enormous. But the emotional pull that would drive you to donate, to advocate, to demand action, it's just not there. The scale has triggered numbing instead of urgency. The mechanism is self-protective. If you felt the full weight of every large-scale tragedy, you'd be crushed. The mind dampens the response to preserve your ability to function. But the cost is that the people who need help the most, the ones suffering on the largest scale, become the ones least likely to receive the emotional response that would mobilize support. The numbing that protects you from overwhelm also insulates you from the scale of need that should. by rights, demand the strongest response. And there's no easy fix. You can't force yourself to feel proportionate concern for mass suffering. The emotional system doesn't work that way. You can recognize the limitation. You can intellectually commit to acting despite the absence of feeling. But the gut-level response, the one that makes care feel urgent rather than obligatory, remains stubbornly resistant to scaling up. The numbing persists, and the gap between the scale of suffering and the scale of emotional response remains. A troubling reminder that human empathy, for all its power in individual cases, has clear and unforgiving limits. Reduced shame reactivity. You did something wrong. You know it. Other people know it. But the discomfort that should accompany that knowledge, the burning sensation of shame that would normally make you want to hide or apologize or fix it, it's just not there. You're aware of the transgression. You understand that it violated a norm. But the emotional cost, the internal punishment that shame delivers, doesn't activate. You move on. And the thing that should have stopped you from doing it again fails to leave any lasting mark. Shame operates as a social regulator. It's the feeling that tells you you've crossed a line, that you've behaved in a way that damages your standing, your reputation, your place in the group. And the discomfort of that feeling is what motivates change. You feel ashamed, so you adjust your behavior to avoid feeling that way again. But when the shame response is reduced, that regulatory mechanism breaks down. The transgression happens. The awareness is there, but the emotional consequence that would drive correction is absent. For some, this reduction is temperamental. The circuitry that generates shame doesn't fire with normal intensity. For others, it's learned. Repeated exposure to shame, particularly in childhood, can lead the brain to dampen the response as protection. Either way, the result is the same. Behavior that should trigger shame doesn't. And without that internal signal, the external feedback, the disapproval of others, becomes easier to dismiss. What this creates in relationships is a pattern of repeated harm without repair. You do something that hurts the other person. They tell you it hurt. You acknowledge it. But you don't feel bad about it. Not in the visceral, uncomfortable way that would make you genuinely want to avoid doing it again. So the apology, if it comes, is hollow, performative. Said because it's expected, not because the shame is driving you to make amends. And the behavior repeats, because the emotional cost that would normally prevent repetition never materialized. The absence of shame also affects how you're perceived. People expect shame. They expect that when you've done something wrong, you'll show signs of discomfort, guilt, embarrassment, regret. When those signs don't appear, it reads as arrogance, as lack of remorse, as proof that you don't care about the harm you've caused. And their interpretation isn't entirely wrong. The reduced reactivity means you're not experiencing the emotional weight that would make the harm feel urgent to address. You're operating without the internal pressure that shame normally provides. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing. Without shame to regulate behavior, the transgressions accumulate. Each one goes unaddressed internally. And the people around you, frustrated by your apparent lack of remorse, eventually stop expecting you to change. They adapt by lowering their expectations, by protecting themselves, by pulling back. And the relationships, starved of the accountability that shame would normally enforce, slowly erode. Not because you're intentionally cruel, but because the mechanism that would make you feel the weight of your actions is missing. And without it, the cycle of harm continues unchecked. Emotional omission style. You don't lie about how you feel. You just don't mention it. Someone asks if you're upset and you say you're fine. Not because you're hiding the truth. Because the truth, the complexity of what you're actually feeling, doesn't make it into words. You omit. You simplify. You reduce your emotional state to the smallest, most manageable version. and what gets left out is everything that would require vulnerability to share. This omission style operates as risk management. Sharing emotions creates exposure. It opens you up to judgment, to misunderstanding, to the possibility that the other person won't respond the way you need them to. So you protect yourself by not sharing. You keep the emotional reality private. And you offer a sanitized version that carries no risk. The surface is calm. The depth stays hidden. The mechanics are subtle. You're not actively deceiving anyone. You're just selective about what you disclose. Someone asks how your day was. It was hard, stressful, full of moments that left you feeling overwhelmed. But you say fine, because unpacking all of that feels too complicated, too heavy, too much to ask of the interaction. So you omit the complexity, and the conversation moves on without you having shared anything real. Over time, this creates a relational pattern where no one actually knows how you're doing. They ask. You give the minimal answer, and they accept it because pushing further feels intrusive. But the result is that your emotional life stays invisible. The struggles you're facing, the feelings you're managing, they remain unshared. And the people who care about you, who would support you if they knew what you were dealing with, never get the chance. Because you've omitted the information that would let them in. The omission style also protects you from accountability. If you don't name what you're feeling, you can't be called out for feeling it. If you don't admit you're angry, no one can challenge the anger. If you don't acknowledge the hurt, you don't have to explain why it's there or what you need in response to it. The omission keeps the emotional terrain vague. And vague, in your calculus, feels safer than specific. But safety through omission comes at a cost. Relationships deepen through emotional disclosure, through the willingness to share what's actually happening inside. And when you systematically omit that, when you keep the emotional reality locked down, the relationship can't move past surface-level exchanges. You're present. You're engaged. But you're not really known. And the people try and connect with you eventually realize that the version of you they have access to is incomplete. The omissions have created a gap. And the gap, over time, becomes the relationship. Polite, functional, empty. Prosocial inhibition. You see someone who needs help. The opportunity to assist is right there, but you don't move. Not because you don't care, not because you're unaware, but because something stops you. A hesitation. A calculus that runs in the background. And by the time you've thought it through, the moment has passed. The person who needed help didn't get it. And you're left with the awareness that you could have acted but chose not to. This is prosocial inhibition, the suppression of helpful behavior despite recognizing the need and having the capacity to respond. It's not cruelty. It's the absence of follow-through. The impulse to help gets overridden by concerns about cost, about awkwardness, about whether your help would even be wanted. And those concerns, reasonable on their own, become reasons not to act. The inhibition wins, and the help stays withheld. The inhibition often stems from social anxiety. Helping requires putting yourself forward, making yourself visible, risking that your offer will be rejected or that you'll do it wrong. And if the fear of those outcomes is strong enough, it blocks the action. You see the person struggling with their bags, but approaching them feels too awkward, so you don't. You notice the colleague who's overwhelmed, but offering assistance feels presumptuous, so you stay silent. The need is clear. The inhibition is stronger. What makes this particularly troubling is how it compounds. Each time you inhibit the prosocial impulse, the inhibition becomes easier. The next time the opportunity arises, the reasons not to help come faster. The threshold for action rises. And eventually, the inhibition becomes your default response. You stop even considering whether to help. The automatic answer is no. And the opportunities to connect, to contribute, To be the person who showed up when it mattered, they all pass unused. The pattern also affects how you see yourself. You're not unkind. You're not selfish. But you're also not the person who helps. And that gap between who you think you are and how you actually behave creates dissonance. You tell yourself you would help if the situation were different, if it weren't so awkward, if you weren't so busy, if you were more certain the help would be welcome. But those qualifications are just the inhibition talking. And the reality is that you're consistently choosing not to act. Not out of malice, out of avoidance. The cost shows up in relationships and in self-concept. People notice who helps and who doesn't. And when you're consistently the one who holds back, who doesn't offer, who lets the moment pass, it shapes how they see you. Reliable in some ways, unavailable in others. And over time, they stop expecting help from you. They stop including you in the category of people they can count on. The inhibition, practiced long enough, becomes who you are, not someone who refuses to help, just someone who never quite does. Moral apathy. Right and wrong used to matter. They don't anymore. Not in the sharp, motivating way they once did. You can still identify what's ethical. You understand the principles. But the feeling that would make those principles compelling, the sense that violating them would be wrong in a way that demands you care, it's gone. The moral framework is intact. The emotional investment in it has evaporated. This moral apathy develops through exhaustion, through repeated exposure to injustice that you couldn't fix, through the wearing down of outrage that led nowhere. You cared, deeply, and caring didn't change anything. So the mind, efficient as always, stopped investing energy in something that produced no return. The principles remain. You can still articulate why something is wrong. But the urgency, the drive to act on that wrongness, has faded. What this looks like in practice is passive observation. You see harm happening. You recognize it as harm. But you don't intervene. You don't speak up. You don't do anything to stop it. Not because you approve, because the emotional charge that would push you to act isn't there. The apathy has replaced it. And without that charge, the harm continues. Observed. Understood. Unaddressed. The apathy also affects how you engage with moral questions. Debates that used to matter feel pointless. Issues that once stirred conviction now feel distant. You can participate in the discussion. You can present arguments. But the passion, the sense that getting this right actually matters, is absent. It's all academic, theoretical, and the distance between recognizing something as important and actually caring about it widens. What makes moral apathy particularly insidious is how it masquerades as maturity. You're not apathetic. You're realistic. You're not disengaged. You're just not naive enough to think your outrage will change anything. And that framing protects the apathy from scrutiny. Because questioning it would require admitting that maybe the exhaustion, the cynicism, the retreat from moral investment has cost you something essential. The capacity to care. The willingness to try. The belief that right and wrong matter enough to fight for. The isolation this creates is quiet. You're not excluded. You're not rejected. You're just increasingly disconnected from the moral concerns that animate the people around you. They care about causes, about justice, about making things better, and you observe their caring from a distance. You understand it intellectually, but you can't access it emotionally. The apathy keeps you detached, and the detachment, sustained long enough, becomes a permanent stance, not actively opposed to morality, just no longer moved by it. Avoidant empathy pattern. You could feel what they're feeling. The capacity is there, but you don't let it activate. The moment you sense their pain rising, you disengage. You redirect. You create distance before the empathic response has a chance to form. Not because you're incapable of empathy, because allowing it to surface would cost you something you're not willing to pay. So you avoid it, systematically, reflexively. And the empathy that could have connected you to them stays locked down. This avoidant pattern operates as self-preservation. Empathy is expensive. It requires you to take on some portion of another person's distress, to let their pain affect you, to carry emotional weight that isn't yours. And if you're already managing your own struggles, if adding theirs feels like it would push you past capacity, the instinct is to avoid triggering the empathic response altogether. Don't engage too closely. Don't ask too many questions. Don't let their suffering land with full force. The avoidance is often unconscious. You're not making a deliberate choice to withhold empathy. You're just noticing, in real time, that leaning into their pain feels overwhelming. So you pull back. You change the subject. You offer solutions instead of presence. You do anything except sit with them in the discomfort of what they're experiencing. And the empathy, blocked before it can fully form, stays dormant. What this does to relationships is profound. Empathy is the foundation of emotional support. It's what makes someone feel seen, understood, less alone in their struggle. But when you avoid it, when you refuse to let their pain touch you, they're left unsupported. They share their distress, and instead of empathy, they get distance. Instead of connection, they get deflection. And the message that sends, whether you intend it or not, is that their pain is too much for you to handle, that they're too much. The pattern reinforces itself. The more you avoid empathy, the easier avoidance becomes. The next time someone's in pain, the reflex to disengage kicks in faster. You've trained yourself to protect your emotional resources by not extending them. And that training generalizes. You start avoiding empathy even in low-stakes situations. Even with people you care about. Even when the cost of engaging would be minimal. The avoidance has become automatic. What makes this particularly damaging is the gap it creates between intention and impact. You care about these people. You want to support them. But your avoidant pattern prevents you from offering the one thing they actually need. Empathy. Presence. The willingness to feel with them rather than just observe from a safe distance. And the relationships, deprived of that emotional resonance, become transactional. You're there for the good times. But when things get hard, when they need you to sit with them in their pain, you're gone. Not physically, but emotionally. And the absence, repeated enough times, erodes the trust that holds the relationship together. Interpersonal frostiness. People say you're cold, distant, hard to reach. And they're not wrong. There's a chill in how you interact. Not hostility. Not rudeness. Just an absence of warmth that makes connection difficult. You respond. You engage. But there's no softness in it. No invitation for closeness. Just a cool, measured distance that keeps people at arm's length whether you intend to or not. This frostiness isn't usually deliberate. It's not a choice you're making in each interaction. It's the accumulated result of self-protection that's hardened into a relational style. At some point, warmth became risky. Opening up led to hurt. Letting people close meant vulnerability. So you cooled down. You created emotional distance. And that distance, initially strategic, became your baseline. You're not trying to be cold. You just are. The frostiness shows up in small ways. The way you don't return a smile quite as warmly. The way your voice stays level when others rise with enthusiasm. The way you don't lean in, don't reach out, don't offer the small gestures of affection that lubricate social interaction. Each absence is minor, but they accumulate. And the cumulative effect is a presentation that reads as emotionally unavailable. People interact with you and walk away feeling like they didn't quite connect. Like there was a barrier they couldn't cross. What makes this particularly difficult is that frostiness creates a self-fulfilling dynamic. People respond to your coolness with their own distance. They mirror the emotional temperature you're projecting. And their retreat confirms what you suspected. People aren't safe. Connection isn't worth the risk. The frostiness was justified. But what you don't see is how your initial coldness triggered their withdrawal. You've created the very distance you were trying to protect yourself from. The pattern also affects how opportunities for connection play out. Someone offers friendship. Your frostiness makes them hesitate. They pull back, uncertain whether the effort will be reciprocated, and you interpret their hesitation as disinterest, as proof that they didn't really want to connect in the first place. The cycle tightens. Your coldness pushes them away. Their distance validates your guardedness, and the possibility of genuine connection dissolves before it ever had a chance to form. What's left is a life of surface interactions. Pull it. Professional, functional, but lacking the warmth that makes relationships feel nourishing. You're not isolated in the obvious sense. You have people around you, but the connections are thin, cool, maintained at a distance that keeps you safe and keeps you alone. The frostiness protects you from the pain of vulnerability, but it also locks you out of the warmth that comes from letting someone in. And the longer the pattern persists, the harder it becomes to thaw. The coldness, once protective, has become permanent. And the relationships that could have sustained you stay frozen at the surface, never reaching the depth where real connection lives. Strategic detachment. You've learned that caring too much costs too much, so you manage it. You ration emotional investment like it's a limited resource that has to be allocated carefully. And in high-stakes situations, in contexts where vulnerability could be weaponized, you deploy detachment deliberately. Not because you can't feel. Because choosing not to feel gives you an advantage. You stay clear-headed while others are clouded by emotion. You make decisions without the drag of attachment. And in that moment, the detachment works exactly as intended. This is strategic detachment, the calculated use of emotional distance as a tool for control and performance. It's not a deficit, it's a skill, cultivated, practiced, refined. You've identified the situations where emotion would be a liability, and you've learned to shut it off when needed. The boardroom, the negotiation, the conflict, anywhere that showing feeling would expose weakness or compromise your position. In those contexts, detachment isn't a failure of connection. It's a competitive edge. The mechanics are deliberate. You recognize the emotional pull starting to form. The attachment, the concern, the investment. And you interrupt it. You redirect your attention. You remind yourself of the stakes. You frame the situation as transactional rather than relational. And the emotion, blocked before it can take hold, stays dormant. You're in control. Focused. Untethered by the feelings that would slow you down or cloud your judgment. What makes this particularly effective is how well it works in the short term. The meeting where everyone else is emotionally reactive and you're the only one thinking clearly. The decision that requires cutting tees, and you're able to do it without hesitation because you never let yourself get attacked in the first place. The negotiation where the other side expects you to care, and your indifference gives you leverage. Strategic detachment delivers results, and the results reinforce the behavior. But the skill, practiced long enough, stops being selective. What started as a tool you could turn on and off becomes a reflex. The detachment that was supposed to activate only in professional contexts starts bleeding into personal ones. You approach relationships with the same calculation. The same rationing of investment. The same protective distance. And the people who need you to be emotionally present, who need connection rather than strategy, find themselves shut out by the very mechanism that makes you effective elsewhere. The cost shows up slowly. Relationships that require vulnerability can't survive strategic detachment. They need genuine investment. Real emotional presence. the willingness to care without calculating whether it's worth the risk. But if you've trained yourself to treat emotion as a liability, if detachment has become your default mode of operating, offering that presence feels impossible, dangerous even, so you stay detached, effective in the contexts where emotion is weakness, isolated in the contexts where emotion is connection, and the skill that gave you an edge in one domain has locked you out of depth in every other. Affective containment overuse. Something upsetting happens. You feel the emotion rising, and immediately you contain it. You box it up, lock it down, put it away where it can't interfere with what you need to do. The containment works. The emotion doesn't spill over. You stay functional, composed, and you move on without letting the feeling derail you. This containment, used occasionally, is adaptive, healthy, even. It lets you manage emotion in real time so you can handle situations that require stability. But when containment becomes your primary emotional strategy, when you're constantly boxing feelings away rather than processing them, the system breaks down. The emotions don't disappear. They accumulate. And the energy required to keep them contained increases until the containment itself becomes exhausting. The overuse develops gradually. You contain one feeling. It works. So you contain the next one. And the next. Each time, the immediate relief reinforces the behavior. You don't have to feel the discomfort. You don't have to deal with the disruption. You just contain it and keep moving. But the contained emotions don't resolve. They sit there, locked away but still present. And the more you accumulate, the more effort it takes to keep the containment intact. What this creates is a constant low-level strain. You're managing an internal pressure that never releases. The emotions you've contained are still there, pressing against the boundaries you've built. And maintaining those boundaries requires vigilance. You can't fully relax. Can't let your guard down, because if you do, the containment might fail. And all the feelings you've been holding back would flood out at once. The overuse also prevents processing. Emotions need to be felt, acknowledged, worked through. That's how they resolve. But when you're constantly containing them, you never give them that space. They stay unprocessed, unresolved, and the backlog grows. You're carrying feelings from months ago, years ago, all still locked in containment because you never created the conditions for them to move through and out. Eventually, the system fails. The containment breaks. Not because you chose to let it go, but because it can't hold anymore. And when it fails, the release is overwhelming. All the emotions you've been managing through containment come flooding back at once. The grief you boxed up, the anger you locked down, the hurt you put away. They all surface simultaneously, and the person who prided themselves on emotional control finds themselves completely overwhelmed by the very feelings they thought they'd successfully managed. The containment worked. Until it didn't. And the cost of overuse becomes devastatingly clear. Trauma-linked numbing. After the trauma, something shifts. The emotions that used to flow naturally now feel distant, muted, like they're happening to someone else. You can observe them forming, recognize that you should be feeling something, but the connection between recognition and actual felt experience is severed. It's not a choice. It's the mind protecting itself the only way it knows how. By shutting the emotional system down before it can be overwhelmed again. This numbing is directly tied to the traumatic event. It doesn't develop slowly. It appears in response to something specific. Something that exceeded your capacity to process in real time. And in the aftermath, the brain, attempting to prevent a repeat of that overwhelm, dampens emotional responsiveness across the board. Not just to trauma reminders. To everything. The system that would normally generate emotional reactions stops functioning at full capacity. And what's left is a pervasive flatness. The numbing affects more than just the traumatic content. Joy becomes muted. Connection feels distant. Even physical sensations can dull. You're operating in a narrowed emotional and sensory range because the mind, in its attempt to protect you from re-experiencing the intensity of the trauma, has turned down the volume on all input. The protection is indiscriminate, and the result is a life where nothing quite lands the way it used to. What makes trauma-linked numbing particularly difficult is that it persists even after the threat has passed. The event is over, you're safe now, but the numbing doesn't lift. The brain, having activated this protective mechanism, doesn't automatically deactivate it once the danger is gone. It stays in place, a safeguard against a threat that no longer exists. And you're left navigating daily life in a state of emotional dampening that was designed for crisis, not for living. Relationships suffer immediately. Emotional presence requires access to your feelings. The ability to be moved, to respond, to connect through shared emotion. But when you're numb, that access is blocked. People reach for you emotionally, and there's nothing there to meet them. Not because you don't care, because the numbing has placed your emotional responses out of reach. You're watching your own life from behind a barrier, present in body, absent in the ways that make presence meaningful. Recovery requires addressing the trauma itself. The numbing won't lift until the mind feels safe enough to restore full emotional function. And safety after trauma is hard to establish. It requires more than just the absence of threat. It requires rebuilding the sense that feeling fully, being emotionally present, won't destroy you, that the risk of re-experiencing intensity is manageable. And until that safety is established, the numbing persists. A protective mechanism that's outlived its usefulness but refuses to release its hold. Compassion recovery difficulty. You used to care easily, deeply. The suffering of others moved you to action. But somewhere along the way, the caring wore out. You gave too much for too long with too little return. And now, even when you want to care, even when you recognize that compassion would be the appropriate response, you can't summon it. The well has run dry, and refilling it feels impossible. This is compassion fatigue taken to its endpoint. Not the temporary depletion that resolves with rest, but a fundamental exhaustion of the empathic system that doesn't recover even when the immediate demands ease. You've exceeded your compassion capacity so thoroughly that the ability to generate care has been damaged. And the path back to compassionate responsiveness, if it exists at all, is unclear. The difficulty shows up in moments where compassion should naturally arise. Someone tells you about their struggle. You recognize, intellectually, that they're in pain. But the emotional response, the pull to help, the felt sense of their suffering, it doesn't activate. You're observing their distress from a place of complete emotional neutrality. Not hostility. Not indifference in the moral sense. Just an absence of the compassionate impulse that would normally be there. The mechanism is broken, and willing it to work doesn't help. What makes recovery so difficult is that compassion, once depleted, doesn't restore through passive rest. You can take time away from the demands that exhausted you. You can protect yourself from further depletion. But that doesn't automatically rebuild the capacity. The neural pathways that support compassionate response, worn down through overuse, don't repair themselves just because the load has been reduced. Recovery requires active rebuilding. And when you're already exhausted, finding the resources for that work feels impossible. The isolation compounds the problem. Compassion is what connects you to others. It's what makes their well-being matter to you in a felt, urgent way. And when you lose access to it, when you're operating without that connective tissue, relationships become transactional. Performative. You go through the motions of caring because it's expected. But the genuine concern, the thing that would make the care real, is missing. And people feel the difference. They pull back. And their withdrawal confirms what you already suspected. You're not capable of the connection they need. The risk is permanence. Compassion recovery isn't guaranteed. Some people rebuild the capacity, others don't. And the longer you operate without it, the more your life structures around its absence. You take on roles that don't require compassionate engagement. You build relationships that function without deep emotional investment. You adapt to a life where care is optional rather than central. And the adaptation, while functional, is a quiet concession that the capacity you once had may not be coming back. Emotional deadening. Nothing moves you anymore. Not joy, not sorrow, not anger or fear or excitement. The full spectrum of emotional experience has narrowed to a flat, grey monotone. You're alive. You're functional. But the richness, the texture, the felt sense of being emotionally present in your own life, it's gone. Everything exists in the same dull register, and the absence of variation, of peaks and valleys, makes life feel less like living and more like going through the motions. This deadening is the end stage of prolonged emotional suppression or trauma or chronic stress. The system that generates emotional responses, overloaded or damaged or shut down for protection, has stopped functioning reliably. You're not numb in the sense of feeling nothing. You're experiencing a profound flattening where emotions, if they register at all, do so with such reduced intensity that they barely qualify as feelings. The deadening has stripped away the emotional color that makes experience meaningful. The mechanics are accumulative. It doesn't happen suddenly. It's the result of years of suppression, or months of unrelenting stress, or the aftermath of trauma that exceeded your processing capacity. Each instance chips away at the system's ability to respond. And eventually, the cumulative damage reaches a threshold. The emotions don't just dampen. They deaden. The system, exhausted or protective or structurally impaired, stops generating the signals that create felt emotional experience. What this does to daily life is profound. Achievements that should feel satisfying produce nothing. Losses that should hurt barely register. Interactions that should spark connection or frustration or warmth all land with the same flat neutrality. You're moving through a world designed to evoke emotional responses, and you're not responding. Not because you're choosing not to, because the capacity to respond has been fundamentally compromised. Relationships become impossible to sustain. Connection requires emotional reciprocity. The other person shares joy, you reflect it back. They express pain, you resonate with it. But when you're deadened, when the emotional signals aren't firing, that reciprocity fails. You receive their emotion. You acknowledge it. But you can't reflect it. Can't resonate. Can't offer the emotional presence that would make them feel met. And the relationship, starved of that exchange, withers. Recovery, if it's possible, requires more than time. It requires addressing whatever caused the deadening in the first place. Trauma needs processing. Chronic stress needs resolution. Suppression patterns need dismantling. But when the deadening is severe, when the emotional system has been offline long enough, even addressing the root cause doesn't guarantee restoration. The damage may be too extensive. The pathways too degraded. And you're left with the possibility that the emotional richness you once had, the capacity to feel things fully, may be permanently diminished. The deadening that started as protection or response to overwhelm has become a fixed feature. And the life you're left with, while functional, is emotionally barren in ways that can't be easily reversed.